Hello, everybody. A very warm welcome to this session. To those of you who could make it to this morning's session, and to those online as well, a very warm welcome. So, my name is Jose Alcorta. I'm the head of standards development at ISO Central Secretariat in Geneva, and obviously, I have a very close interest in at this topic today. So we're going to look at standards, accreditation, trust, and all those things that underpin our climate actions. So I'm going to hand over to the chair for this morning, which is Martin Baxter from IEMA. And Martin, take us through what we're planning for this session. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Jose, and thank you, everybody, for joining us here at COP28 and online, the live stream. It's incredibly exciting to be here, and I've seen so many things. It's just incredible to be able to engage with so many people who have a massive passion for driving climate action. And I think the role of standards in being able to do that on a global basis is a really inspirational kind of way of being able to become part of the solution. So a lot of the work that we come across here is about some of the problems that we face, and actually I think working with standards and a community of global people who are committed to some technical work but actually driving meaning and engagement across all of the organisations that are engaged in our work is incredible. So it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be part of this. Just a little bit about my role. So although I'm in my day job, I work for IEMA, with the professional body for people working in sustainability, and as a membership association with, I think, 22,000 members in 120 countries around the world. It's fantastic for us to be able to both disseminate information about standards and, crucially, to be able to bring that community of expertise into the standards making process and be able to share that around the world. So that's one of the things that I've been able to do, and I chair the group in ISO that's responsible for the environmental management system standard. Now then, Emily has told me I'm not allowed to mention any numbers. I'm going to mention two numbers here. So one is, because people might have heard of ISO 14001, that's the end of that, but we have over 500,000 users of that standard. Okay, and that is one of the standards across many in ISO's portfolio that can contribute to driving climate action. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to firstly introduce, I'm going to ask my fellow collaborators on this to introduce, and then I'll come back and make a few remarks. And then we've got some questions that we're going to work through, both here as a team, but also to engage people in the room as well. So I've introduced myself as Martin. I'm going to introduce...
Good morning, everyone. My name is Emily Faint, and I am the Net Zero Policy Manager at BSI, or the British Standards Institution, if you don't know us. BSI is the UK's national standards body and member to the International Standards System, ISO, IEC, ITU, and others, and I'm really, really excited about this discussion.
Thank you. And Emily was slightly modest there because she led a lot of the work on developing the net zero guidance from ISO in what I would kind of say record time. And so, yeah, making that contribution really important. And now I'm going to hand over to Silvio.
Thanks, Martin. Also, I'd like to extend my welcome to you being here present with us at our pavilion. We know that we are competing with many, many other exciting discussions here taking place at COP28. Thanks for the privilege of being with us. The same for the folks online. There are many other opportunities. Thanks for watching us. So I'm Silvio Dolinsky, Deputy Secretary General of ISO. So for us, ISO at this COP has been a fantastic experience, bringing this standards pavilion where we really want this to be a space for everyone who is interested in standards and the whole ecosystem related to conformity assessment, quality infrastructure, to have these discussions about how standards and the conformity assessment can support making progress at the speed and with the determination that is required to address climate action. So with that, back to you, Martin.
Great, thank you, Silvio and Emily. And so I did want to just remind everybody of what the theme is today, because it is about youth, children and skills. And I think a really important part of engaging in standards work is actually building the capacity and capability to drive change in organizations. Our standards are fantastic ways to be able to do that, but we do need people with the capability to implement them. And so we will be spending some of the conversation today thinking about how do we do that, both from a participation in this standards making process. We live in a world of many, many countries, 200 or so, and I think ISO has over 180 countries who are member bodies. 168. So 168 countries come together within ISO to co-create standards. That's an incredible process. But what we do need to do is make sure that we enable people to play that role. And I think the work that we'll hear about today is we have some of that in action. We've got more to do, and ideas about how we do that would be really good when we open up the conversation. So that skills and youth and getting people involved is something that personally I'm really passionate about. It's been fantastic actually being here to speak to so many young people from different parts of the world who are committed to climate action. But moving on to some of the key issues that we want to explore in this session. So underpinning accountability in standards and accreditation and skills to meet climate commitments. So we're going to kind of explore these, but I wanted to just give a little bit of a sense of this overarching architecture that we already have in place, because I think in a lot of the discussions that we see here, we see the reinvention of the wheel would be a phrase that I would use, where people are looking to create new standards in their own specific domains. They're looking to set up ways of offering a form of assurance. And actually, we have a global architecture which has a long history of being able to support global trade, underpinned by trust in terms of a standard that's been built by consensus. And I think that word consensus is really important. It's very easy for somebody to say, here's my standard, I've set it. And if you say, well, who's been involved in setting this standard that somebody's asking everybody to follow, that's when we start to ask questions. And I think so this collaborative approach to engagement of ISO standards and member bodies around the world, and it's one member, one vote, so we don't weight those votes. So the UK, the US has the same vote as Sierra Leone and Honduras. And I think that's really important in terms of democratic accountability into the processes that we have for developing those standards. We also have standards which support some of the work that is being developed here. So a lot of activity is around disclosure, and people will have heard of things like the International Standards, Sustainability Standards Board, introducing new requirements for disclosure in audits in the finance system, and I think that's incredibly important. And it was really encouraging to see ISO and the International Reporting Council Foundation coming together to say, actually, we're going to collaborate. We're not going to duplicate. We're going to look at how standards can be a contribution to these disclosure things that are coming forward. So that's a really important move. But ISO's portfolio of standards goes way beyond that in terms of providing trust to people, to trust to businesses. So 25,000 standards in ISO's portfolio. They're all around us, and yet we don't see them. And I think that's something that's worth exploring in this session, because the public protection and assurance that can be provided to businesses with business relationships that's already in existence can be applied in the context of driving climate action, both in terms of mitigation and climate adaptation. So I think exploring some of that will be really important as well. So I think let's get into this first question around, how do we build the trusted goods, products and services for the future net zero economy and the skilled workforce to deliver them. So I'm going to pass over to Emily to have the first go on this and see where we get, and then we'll take some questions from the floor before we move on to the second question.
Thank you very much. So, from my perspective as the Net Zero Policy Manager in BSI, I have the privilege to spend all of my time thinking about the role of standards, specifically addressing the very important goal we all collectively have to reach of net zero. And as Martin very kindly alluded to earlier, one of the pieces of work that I led on in the last year is the development of the ISO Net Zero Guidelines, which was the first deliverable to define net zero in the ISO system, which, when you think about it was a really urgently needed gap to fill, because actually if we don't have a definition and a common reference point for net zero, it's very hard to get into the real meat of this question that's been posed to us about how do we build a future net zero resilient economy and all the goods, products and services needed to deliver that. So the first thing is we need to have a recognized international standard on net zero. To help people have a common, clear understanding of what good looks like for net zero. And there's a whole discussion we could have about net zero integrity if we have time on that point. But we also need to make sure that we are scaling that through the quality infrastructure that Martin has rightly alluded to, that we all sit in, we all live our lives in every day. So a way I like to shine a light on this invisible system we all depend on is if you bought a coffee or you bought your breakfast from a restaurant or a cafe this morning on the way to this event, you put that food in your mouth implicitly trusting it was safe to eat. You trusted, you didn't ask where it was from or who made it. You had a clear sense that that was a product you could trust. And that is a system that we all rely on day to day for everything we purchase. If we could leverage this system of quality infrastructure, of standards, of accreditation, of conformity assessment and metrology towards addressing climate action and specifically net zero, we would transform the way that the economy works. But to do so, we need to make sure that all of the best practice, all of the high integrity criteria that we are awash with at events like COP is actually reflected in this system. So my message on this question in particular is, if you are a climate solution provider, if you are publishing reports calling for action, if you are developing your own voluntary initiatives or your own frameworks and your own toolkit, if you are not engaging with the ISO system, the formal international standard system, and making sure that your solutions are reflected in development of recognized international standards, then we cannot scale it to help deliver on that future net zero economy and underpin the goods, services and products that we are all going to need by 2050 and certainly prior to that as well. So that would be the first points I'd like to put on all of your radar, but I'll pass back to you, Martin and Silvio, to build on that.
Thanks, and I think that whole issue around scalability is really, really important. I'll pass on over to Silvio.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to bring here the aspect of the capacity building efforts that we are doing at ISO. I think that, and why that? Because in order for this to work globally, we need to achieve scale, and we need the legitimacy that we will only have if we engage a large part of our members across the world. If the work of developing standards and then afterwards the whole quality infrastructure system around the world does not include the global south and the developing countries, we will not make this work for a large part of the population around the globe that will suffer the impact of the climate change and everything that we talk about. So therefore, at ISO, what we really make a big effort to do is to think about the processes that are required and mobilize the funds that are required to develop the capacity in our members. In many countries where these are organizations with less than 10 people, with very limited resources, and with also that they are trying to mobilize experts, trying to mobilize stakeholders in their countries, who also face challenges to be dedicating time to standards development on top of their work. I think the way the global economy is structured, unfortunately, it's much easier for organizations like BSI, like many others, to have the resources to engage in this process than organizations in many other parts. So that is one strong effort that we are doing, and the challenge that we face there is really how we can mobilize more resources to be able to scale it, to have more of these great minds around the world that could be participating in that process, and unfortunately do not have that opportunity.
Thanks. And I think when I look at the ISO climate commitments, and which is a really powerful declaration. I mean, some people call it the London Declaration, but the ISO climate commitment has been a really important way of showcasing how ISO is intending to move forward in terms of integrating climate action into the standards portfolio that it has. And clearly there is the development of new standards, and people have been talking about hydrogen as a really good example. But I think where I see a real opportunity to build capacities through the existing standards that we have, and to be able to articulate back to people actually how you can use these in a more progressive way. And I think the work that's happening in quality and asset management and occupational safety and health, where in a very short space of time they're going to have to start to think about how does climate action feature in that work program. It's going to take quite a little bit of quite a lot of explaining, because people don't obviously see it. Having worked with the leaders of the groups involved in those standards, it's once you start to give examples of why this is important, then people can start to appreciate it. I think this almost like storytelling narrative around how you can take action through the work that you do is really important. So one aspect is in quality. We've had an example in the UK, or lots of examples, where extreme temperatures, so extreme heat, has led to our infrastructure failing, and that then either causes a loss of income. It really affects people's lives. We have it on our transportation system. We've seen it in private companies where a zoo, believe it or not, had the pavements and the walkways around the exhibits melting in high temperatures. So they had to shut down for a few days. It cost them a lot of foregone income. And so that was a product that was developed without reference to future temperatures that we're facing. So I think starting to explain how some of the standards that we have that are not obviously related to climate change, but we'll actually start to have to think about this, is going to be important. Worker protection is going to be incredibly important, as well as we get into occupational safety and health. So we are going to have to think about how we communicate all of this, and the standards bodies don't have access to the customer base, but the accredited conformity assessment bodies do, and I think so we need to think about how we can communicate that out. I don't know, Emily, you know, your net zero guidelines have a really powerful role to play, but the question, I guess, is in part, how do we get that communicated out to a wider audience so they understand what good practice looks like, and people can start to take action?
Yeah, great question. I think when it comes to the dissemination of best practice, this is where standards bodies and these quality infrastructure institutions have a really broad role to play. BSI published some research earlier this year on the role of standards in driving transformative innovation, which showed that actually the impact of a standard is measured not just from the ability to write one and publish it, but actually the concerted engagement in getting it disseminated and used as quickly as possible. That is as great an indicator of the impact of a standard as well as whether you've written one in the first place. In terms of the ISO net zero guidelines specifically that you refer to, Martin, the key message is if you are an organization that has a net zero strategy, but you're not sure if you're doing everything right, you can use the ISO net zero guidelines to review your strategy against its recommendations and identify what gaps exist. And the really key thing to note here is that when we talk about net zero, we're not just talking about target setting or reporting or the areas of best practice that often get the most profile. We're talking about the entire journey, right from the ability to align your internal governance around net zero commitments, making sure there's someone on your board who's empowered to say, actually, we do need to put this into our quarterly reports. We do need to invest now, even if we're not going to see a return until next year. That's a critically important part that the guidelines highlight. And also, again, integrating into the areas we hear about often at events like COP, like the role of nature and biodiversity, considerations of fair share and a just transition. That is all something that every single organization in the world needs to make their new normal and their new standard for net zero action. But I also want to return back to the excellent points that you made, Sylvia, about capacity building, because if we are using the same language to speak to the same audiences, and particularly only those who have the resources to really engage right now, then we won't actually succeed in scaling action across the whole world. So I think there's a really interesting conversation to be had, whether you are in a standards body and making sure that you are reaching out to those that you don't normally engage in climate action. But also, as I said earlier, if you're an organization that you consider yourself to be involved in climate action, you consider yourself to be a solution provider, make sure that you are bringing that best practice to the international standard system, because that best practice is going to be the thing that these accredited conformity assessment bodies can actually go out and check compliance against. Because what is the problem we're actually trying to address here? We're trying to address a lack of clarity. That's where standards come in. We're trying to address a lack of integrity. That's where standards come in. And we're trying to address a lack of compliance and of accountability. And that is, again, where these wider institutions of accreditation and conformity assessment and market surveillance that we already rely on day to day can come in and help. So driving greater awareness towards these systems and making sure that they actually are representing all of the voices and all of the solutions out there in the market is so key. We cannot have a system built just on the voices of, say, major industry or global north countries. We will not get the just transition to net zero that we are all claiming we want.
Thanks, Emily. Now, I'm going to open it up for any comments that people want to provide or any questions. So if you could just say who you are, that would be great. Thanks.
I'm Carmen Virasoro. Good morning, everyone. I come from Argentina, and having worked at the ISO 14020 series at the international and national level, I find these comments very relevant indeed, and I would like to raise one question. The challenge to bring on board in this pilot phase of net zero building standards the so-called right stakeholders, or at least the pertinent stakeholders. That is quite a challenge at the local level, and I presume also at the international level. And that is something that we should analyze in the strategy groups of standard settings, because it is a key component. There are many barriers of this to this participation, but I presume that this can be addressed with the right tools and with the right partners. Thank you.
Did you want to answer that question? Okay, we'll come back.
I love that question, unsurprisingly, given that I think about net zero full time. I mean, I think a great example I could refer to is the IWA process, an international workshop agreement process that was used to develop the ISO net zero guidelines. So we convened over 1,200 organizations from over 100 countries to deliver that. I think the actual final count was somewhere around 113 countries. And one of the best statistics I saw from that cohort was that around 75% of those participants had never participated in an ISO process before. And the output that generated reflected incredible ambition, and again reflected concepts that normally we see in the policy space and had never yet seen in an ISO deliverable before, namely in particular those areas around fair share, equity and a just transition. That's what happens when we bring new voices into this system that don't normally sit in our technical committees. So I would say there are two key groups in particular I would highlight about how we get them in. The first group is actually the group that we are surrounded by here at COP28, which is the leading voluntary initiatives that are actually governing a great deal of the net zero governance landscape at the moment. I'm referring to, of course, the fantastic work of organizations such as CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, the Science Based Targets Initiative, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, ICVCM, VCMI, the alphabet soup as we often refer to them. They have done fantastic work in raising awareness in the market that there needs to be greater clarity on these aspects of net zero. But to my point earlier, and to the point made by my co-panelists, we won't scale those in a verifiable, trusted way unless we scale that criteria through quality infrastructure and recognize international standards. So we need to actively call on those organizations and the experts that support them to join the standards committees in the ISO system to make sure that that is reflected in the development of current and future climate standards. The second group, which really must not be overlooked, is those who are experts in, particularly in those in lower income regions, who maybe have never heard the call to action that standards is the way to engage in climate action. Many of us, in particular young people, think the way to get involved in climate action today is they need to join a campaign or an NGO or a government. They don't know about this incredibly important instrument of international standards. So what language changes can we use to engage those people? How can we say, are you interested in climate accountability? Are you interested in helping companies to decarbonize? Are you interested in scaling awareness of the role of nature and biodiversity? If the answer is yes, then come and join your National Standards Committee on Climate. And so I think that language change, that outreach to new groups, and also the welcoming in of these existing groups that dominate the net zero landscape is a really important thing we need to do to scale those concepts of net zero and make sure that all voices are truly heard.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, that raises another barrier. How do we improve access to national committees?
So that's a question around enhancing access to national committees. Do you want to have a go at that, or do I? Well, what we found is sometimes it's not bringing people into a national committee. Sometimes it's taking a national committee and its work program out to where the audience is, and translating some of the very deep technical content into a more accessible process. So Emily outlined how the Net Zero International Workshop Agreement process went, and that was fantastic. When we did the last big change to the Environmental Management System standard, in order to inform our committee's work and at that time the UK's input into that standard, we did workshops, and I'd met with 400 people before we started that process. So we gave them an open sheet of paper and we said, what do you want to achieve from updating this standard to something that's going to have significant change? And then we distilled that back into a survey to test out and said, this is what we think we've heard. And then we pushed that back out to say, okay, well, how strongly do you support this? Is this what you really want? And that gave a mandate then to developing the positions that we were advocating in that process. So in that context, we had over 1,000 people who had expressed a view in a 2-week window of what they wanted to see in that standard. And I think thinking creatively about that doesn't mean that somebody has to come, or you need all of these people sat in a room going through line by line by line. I think there are other ways in which we're able to engage people. So that's another example. I think you wanted to come in with a question, didn't you?
Thank you very much. I'm called Pamela Msimenta. I'm from Uganda. I'm a water resources engineer and a founder of the Youth Career Talk Show from Uganda. I like the conversation. You were talking about the international standards and setting standards that are common to everyone, I think across the whole world. And today being a youth, children and education skills platform, I wanted to know how can the youth be involved in actually sitting on the tables where these policies or standards are going to be formed. Because personally back home, we have a lot of policies. We have a lot of national policies that guide every other thing. I've seen converting climate committees into action. We've also had such policies in our countries, but such standards and policies are set by people from above. Like, if you get what I'm saying, you find that only the people maybe who are much experienced, who are there already, are the ones setting these standards, and the youth who are actually the most, who are going to feel the impacts of this climate change, you find they don't have a platform on these tables to also contribute, because apparently in Uganda, I think 78% of the population are the youth. So you can imagine, like, we are the generations, the future generations that are going to face the impacts of climate change. So how do we make sure that the youth, the children that we're talking about today, can sit on these tables and contribute to setting these national standards? I think he talked about capacity building. How do we make sure that capacity is actually built for these youth, the young people? How do we learn how to contribute to setting the standards, giving our contributions, our ideas as the youth? Thank you.
If I can make a start, and actually my vice chair in the International Standards Organization work that I do is from Uganda, and so and he's been absolutely fantastic in providing support, and we have a dual role to help. He helps me, I help him, and that collaboration. I think getting a youth voice into ISO's standardization processes is a really interesting one. I'm going to look to my right here, because that capacity building process has many dimensions. So one is about how do you get youth into the standard setting process, but also how do we channel the enthusiasm that young people have to want to drive climate action, to see that they can do that through developing a career which can be part of implementing and applying standards which are driving in this area. And I might come to somebody who was leading a discussion earlier who's got a very specific problem in terms of a lot of work that needs to be done and doesn't have the capacity and the capability to do it at the moment. So, but I'll hand over to you first.
Thanks, Martin. So maybe I share two main comments. So one is, at a more structural level at ISO, we have three main pillars or dimensions where we focus on inclusivity in the whole standards development process. It's on gender, youth, and developing countries. So on gender, we have started already several years ago a program that is very structured, well-funded, mobilizing the network of our members to make sure that we increase significantly the participation of women into the different technical committees, but also in leadership positions within those technical committees, and make sure that we have an effective participation of women in those processes. With the also objective that the standards are gender responsive. So and there are many examples where unfortunately in the past standards did not consider sufficiently the difference between males and females in multiple areas of society. And we are really trying to address that by bringing more women into the process. On developing country, before coming to the youth, on developing country, it's, as I mentioned before, we do have 2/3 of our members are national standards bodies from developing countries. We have a structure which is a policy committee where we mobilize and ensure that the developing countries have maybe I don't like that word, but for lack of a better one, it's like quotas, or it's like a minimum numbers of participations from developing countries, either in our different governance structures, beyond on the council, beyond all the different bodies of governance of ISO, but also sponsoring experts from developing countries to be able to travel, to participate in the different activities of our technical community. And here at COP, compared to, this is the second year, to take an example here, it's the second year that we are participating with space institutionally as ISO. This year, we really sponsored many of our members from developing countries to participate, so that when they we incentivize them, support them to become parts of their national delegations, but often they would have then the economic barrier of being able to travel here. So then ISO, we are sponsoring those members to come and participate, and that has been fundamental in terms of how we have been able to mobilize so all our network to really participate in the different sessions that we're having, the discussions, and representing the standards ecosystem in all the different national pavilions and everything that is happening here. When it comes to youth, so that is, we do have a program called the Young Professionals Program, where we are really focusing on work with some of our members, and it's a pity that our colleague from Denmark, who was in the previous session, is not here, because they are very, very successful in engaging the youth. I don't know whether BSI has good experiences there. I would tend to think so, because BSI is so good in so many things, so hopefully also on this one. They are over leading the edge of many things. But there is a challenge with the youth very often, because if I compare with the gender, it's like there's absolutely no doubt that there are many, many women that are super experienced, capable. It's like to be participating in our technical committees, having the discussions with the same level of technical knowledge as the males, right? Unfortunately, it's dominated by males, but there are many women. It's about breaking the barriers there. And with the youth, we face a little bit of a bigger challenge, because what happens, someone who has 3 years of experience graduating from university to participate in a technical discussion where everyone else has 20 plus years in that area, super deep, a club that have been working together for many years, it's very difficult for their participation to be effective there. It's like we can bring the youth there, but then how do we avoid that they are only listening to the discussion, but they truly engage in it? I think that's the main barrier that we are trying to crack. And you pointed to some solutions, right? Maybe there are ways where we bring them to provide the input as advisors, have different conversations. Because if we simply bring the youth into the technical committee and let them listen there, we have seen that it doesn't lead to the results that we aim. It's like we do need to be a little bit more creative there. And the other example that I want to bring is, actually I was talking before the session with a young man from Brazil, and they are working with an organization in France and mobilize resources to train young leaders from the Amazon to have the technical capacity and knowledge and language skills also to participate in international discussions related to regulations and also standard making. So I think that with the youth, we do need a dedicated effort to accelerate the pace of their technical development capabilities so that they can engage more effectively. And we see some good examples of happening there. And now hopefully BSI will have some good examples to share.
Well, without being too awkward about it, I am youth, so I feel very qualified to comment on this. So Silvio set out brilliantly all the different programs that are on offer globally through ISO for young people to get involved. But from a national standards body perspective, I actually wanted to pick up on something you said, which I love, where you said 78% of the Ugandan population is youth. The point of a national standards body is to reflect its national stakeholder views in the development of international standards. So my point is quite simple. If the majority of your national population are youth, then your standards body should be reflecting your views and supporting you to join the committees, because you are the majority voice. What we need to do, and it comes back to the language point I made earlier, is we need to change the way that we communicate the role of standards to those who are already passionate, already educated, and already willing to drive action. So I was involved in the ISO Net Zero Guidelines development process just maybe 4 or 5 years out of university. So I had a huge amount to learn, but I think if you are already passionate about climate action and you have a strong network of people who are engaged in the subject area, you can learn I promise you can learn quickly. I think we need to really reduce the perception that it is something that only 20 years of technical experience will allow you to participate in. If you get in touch with your national standards body, ask them what climate standards committees exist, and if you can join, you can help spread the word to your network and say this is a key forum for us to engage with and learn. And certainly from the BSI perspective, we allow free participation in standards development. So in the UK, you just need to submit your CV, your resume, and within 4 weeks you can be approved to join. So these processes are actually much simpler than we think. And I think if we just communicate that clearly into networks and groups of people already motivated on the subject area, we can help channel more young leaders into this system now. We don't have to wait.
If I may supplement those comments as well. So it's all up, you said it quite right, it's all about accessibility and changing the perception. So what we have in ISO is a number of programs that they are not well known. So you mentioned the youth program that Silvio alluded to, and there are good examples in the area of environmental management. We had the winners of the essay from last year that did a fantastic research on sea level rising and the adaptation to those changes. So that initial work was presented to the committee, and they were fascinated by their engagement and the good thinking behind the thesis that they produced. So there's a continuity on that, and now those students are involved in National Mirror Committee work, and that will evolve into being an international standard. They're working on a proposal. So that's one example, but there should be many more like that. So in view of that, I think that ISO is trying to produce the tools for people to engage in a much easier way. So you will remember pre-pandemic physical meetings, we had around 30 ISO meetings a day, every day of the year, and people had to travel to go to those. Now we're moving into 50 meetings a day, committee meetings a day, every day of the year, and most of them are still virtual with some physical presence in those meetings. But again, that's not enough. So we have, there's an ISO project called the Open Consultation, which is started earlier this summer, and is looking at not only taking into account the inputs from those in the system, in the national committees, but everybody else. So it's all about, there are at least 2 consultations on the drafting of standards, and this is when we want all those voices heard. So it's not just those that sit in the Mirror Committee, because we know that they have to represent stakeholder views, groups of stakeholders, no individual views, otherwise you have hundreds of people with their own individual perceptions. So that's part of that project, that it takes into account those views and the youth. And we started years ago. Again, consumers are very important as well as a stakeholder group. They lack the funding, they lack the access, and this is where we have to work. So it's a combination of providing the tools, but if we don't have the awareness and the member bodies are not saying, you need to talk about those issues, come and tell us, then things will not progress. So I think that's the key for me. Thank you.
Great. So some action is underway, but I think the answer is that we need a lot more, and we need to be more proactive in finding the groups and bringing and taking our work to them and drawing them in. I'm going to look around. Are there other questions or observations that people want to make? Were you going to? I don't know whether you want to speak about, because I think one of the big things is not just the engagement of youth in the standards making process, it's the deployment of standards through young people doing work and actually having a job and a career that can contribute to driving climate action and the work that standards can make. And I think maybe you've got some experience in not having enough people.
Yeah, as I spoke earlier, it's been, speaking for our accreditation body, we run a accreditation body, and our role is to accredit third-party validation and verification bodies. And those validation and verification bodies are responsible for auditing primarily carbon disclosure statements. It's a difficulty for us getting the right resources and also getting younger people involved in the process. It's also difficult for the conformity assessment bodies themselves in terms of there's a lot of turnover, in this industry. I mean, that's one issue, is people will stay in one place for, a few months and then they'll move on to the next opportunity. But just delivering the message of why it would be a valuable and a good place to go in one's career, I think we need to improve on that. So I'd like some ideas, maybe how to do that more effectively. We have done outreach to, university systems and those kinds of forums, to see if we can get people more engaged. But I think there are some obstacles. People don't like to travel as much as we would like them to, right? That could be an obstacle. The reporting, I think, is another challenge. People don't like writing long reports, right? I mean, if there's a way that we can make these processes more efficient and more simple, I think, that personally is one of my considerations, is maybe we could get people more interested. But I'd like to hear if you have some bright ideas as well.
Thanks. I mean, one of the things that we've done is develop something called a Green Careers Hub, and it actually provides information on different career options that people can take a journey into becoming, part of the solution to climate change, environmental degradation, driving, towards a more sustainable future. And what we find is that by putting together content around the different types of jobs that are around, and that includes people who are doing audits, people who are implementing environmental management systems, people who are working in sustainability roles, but also other jobs that are going to be really, really important. We haven't really explored in this session the work on things like the hydrogen economy and the way in which that's going to be developed. The big increase in renewables, standards underpin a lot of the technologies that are being deployed in terms of clean and green energy, but we also need people to be able to install and maintain all of that. And so explaining how they can be part of that journey and then developing the capacity building and the skills to be able to fulfill those roles, I think is really important as well. So yeah, but I think your point about the way in which work is done is changing, and will have to change if we're going to be able to do everything that we need to do. I'm looking around. Has anybody got any other questions or points that they'd like to raise in this session? I'm looking around. No?
I was actually interested in following up on your points about sort of youth mobilization in Uganda. Can you share some insights with us on what kind of areas of climate action you think that these young experts would be most interested in working on? It'd be great to understand more about what's driving people, and then understand maybe what areas of standardization we can support them to get involved in. So any insights you have, whether it's on adaptation work or biodiversity or mitigation or specific technologies like hydrogen, anything like that, I'd be interested.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there is a lot of work that is being done by the youth. For example, my colleague here, I think he can speak for himself. He has something called a 1 million tree campaign. Yes.
Hello everyone, I'm Dixon Bandajira. I'm a climate justice activist and environmentalist. I'm the national coordinator for 1 million tree planting campaign. We started it in 2019, and we have managed to plant over 600,000 trees now. We do this in communities, we do climate education, because we want to teach children in schools that this is a crisis, and for us to defeat it, we need everyone involved. We have a water problem in our country, and we have a project of extending safe water to every community. We construct boreholes to different communities and provide tanks to them so that we can at least try to improve on the standards of living of the people, because water is essential. And very many people fall sick because they have no safe water for drinking. We help the women empowerment, and we work with Mohocha IDP camp. These are climate victims. They lost their homes and they now live in the camp. the problems that they are facing, they are beyond, like, in Uganda, almost 80% of the people earn less than $1 a day. And these are people in the camp, the women, the children, and they cannot even afford food. So we help them with farming. We get land for them and start up farming so that they can start growing their own food. We provide water, and we have a project of reusable sanitary pads whereby we help the women, since they cannot afford to buy the normal standard pads, and we do reusable ones for them. So if you know people who are in Uganda, they can visit these areas. We get in touch with them. Maybe they can try to improve on our work.
I can also add something. In terms of also that, I think Uganda, through the government, it formed what is called National Council. So we also have people who are part of that National Council that sometimes are involved in forming the policies. But like I said, usually, and I think you put it right as well, usually people are just from campus, maybe don't have a lot of experience, like people who have been in the space for long. So what I did personally, like I told you, I'm a founder of Youth Career Talk Show. So I got an opportunity to work with government when I was just done with my university. So I found that there was a gap. My colleague here, they have different interventions that the youth are doing, but you find that people are failing to actually find a career in these spaces. So what I do is that I gather different people who already have experience, like maybe you. We call upon you, like quarterly, we held talks to guide the youth. How can you develop a career out of what is happening? If these people are planting 1 million trees, they are informing other people, but is there a career that someone can actually find? We have people who are struggling, but they can come and help us actually be the ones maybe to collect the tree seedlings from a particular place. So we try to gather people in terms of that. So but in adaptation, loss and damage, we've had a lot of interventions that are being done by different platforms, of course, yeah. So the youth are actually getting engaged in our country, so like they are not being engaged, but I think there is just a lot that needs to be done, and I think people need to be informed. There's a lot of capacity building that needs to be done as well, yeah.
I mean, I think that brings up a lot of really excellent points around sort of the need for skills, clear career pathways, because that's how we don't just stick with enthusiasm, but we actually turn that into expertise that we retain in the system for the entire lifetime of these experts. So maybe, Martin, you want to talk on the skills point, and then on the capacity building as well.
Yeah, I mean, the way in which we look at skills is, on the one hand, knowledge, and it's great to hear, tree planting is a fantastic way of helping to manage water, as well as, other aspects as well. So we need that knowledge, but also it's, how do we get things done? And that requires a whole different set of skills. It requires, you're working collaboratively with people, and you're working in partnership, and so we don't tend to teach people how to do that. It's one of those areas that you get by experience, but actually we could do so much more to prepare people to work in partnership, work with different stakeholders. Suddenly you have then a bigger pool of people who can work collaboratively, who can work together to get something achieved. Project management is a really good skill. So when we're defining our competency criteria, we look at what's the underpinning knowledge that's needed around sustainability, so that you can build from that. We also, there's lots of kind of policies and standards and methodologies that you might need to apply, and you need to have an understanding of those depending on your role. But then sometimes you call them soft skills, but I think transferable skills, which are really important to employers around problem solving, analytical thinking, being able to see that bigger system, project management, communication, really important as well, whether it's from storytelling to the ability to engage groups in different languages, in different cultures, in different contexts, and see how you can project to their understanding rather than just explaining what you know to them. I think all of those are really important skills, and having programs of development that support that through capacity building, I think, is an area that we have. We have groups in Sub-Saharan Africa, we have groups in Middle East, North Africa, in India, and they all use this framework to help to develop the skills and capability, and there are training programs that allow them to engage in that. And interestingly, we also see kind of quite a lot of standards actually being referred to in degree programs, so university programs, particularly around environmental management. So those standards are also kind of embedded as well.
Just kind of throwing an idea out there. I don't know if this is the forum, but I was just wondering, have you guys looked at partnering with the likes of like the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership? Because I just think if you could do like an online module and then, maybe break down the cost barriers and have that, certain countries or a certain number of scholarships or something like that to sort of boost the knowledge that's around. People can do it as they like from anywhere in the world.
So this was a question about whether we have participated with the Cambridge Programme for Sustainability Leadership or other programs where we could have maybe massive online communities of learning and engagement. We've done some of that. We do engage with Cambridge. We work with about 40 universities as IEMA, including some outside the UK, to put this learning into practice. We also have something called an IEMA Futures Group, which is young people who are either students or early career professionals who have a voice in our organisation. And sometimes we buddy them up with people who are experienced, so that can be quite useful, but also it's good that they articulate to us what they need in terms of learning and development opportunities, and providing frameworks for people to understand the different skills that they need to over time acquire to become really proficient in driving change. And I think for us it's all about how do you prepare people to be climate activists in the world of work, because that's how we get things done and that's how we drive change. So those are really good ideas, and I think looking at where we can get funding to be able to do that on a much bigger scale would be really important as well. We have linked some of our qualifications back into people who are still at school, so 16 to 18-year-olds, and that's also got international potential and outreach. So again, that would be free in terms of the resources that are enabled, but it gives people the opportunity to develop project work and align to skills development, which then give them a passport into university, which is lower grades than would normally be the case. So there's kind of some personal incentive for a student. They learn some skills which employers say are really important, so it's not just about academic learning and knowledge acquisition, it's the ability to get things done. I'm looking around to see whether, because I'm conscious of time, we've got half a minute left, and I think yeah, what is it that we really want to see? I'm going to go round the panel here, just in terms of if there was one thing you wanted to see change, what would it be, and what action do we need to take as ourselves actually kind of to get that done?
Well, I think there are two actually. One is mobilization of resources that we see here at the COP, for example. There are many multilateral banks, funds that are really putting money available to finance the transition towards net zero and adaptation, both mitigation and adaptation, meaning infrastructure, renewable energy, but there is also part of these funds dedicated to develop capacity training and the talent, technical assistance. And I think that the standards community, the ecosystem, we need to see how we can maybe channel part of those funds to develop this this part of the skills. And then now I come to the second one, which is already my previous work experience. It's like I was very familiar with some industries facing a very strong skills shortage for their future. If you think about some of the cement industry or the oil and gas, it's like many of these industries face a huge challenge in attracting young generations to work with them, to have the talent. And in the standards industry, I'm starting to realize that we also have a little bit of that challenge, and we need to maybe focus on that a little bit more with more strategic mind there. So that's a learning for me from this session. Thank you.
Thanks.
And for me, it's really just to recap what I've said throughout this session, which is if you are a person in the climate action space, whether you are a young professional, you're further ahead in your career, and you've never engaged with your national standards body, make 2024 the year that you do. You can find, wherever you are in the world, iso.org/members, and you can find your national standards body and get in touch with them and ask how you can get involved. And that's how you can unlock these really important conversations around joining relevant committees and understanding what skills you may need to plan for to help you participate effectively. If you are in a government or policy-making institution, I think my call to action would be to engage more with your national standards body and the accreditation services and conformity assessment institutions in your country, because that's how we can really mobilize the resources, as Silvio has rightly said, towards these institutions that are designed to manage quality and underpin that with trust and scale action quickly. And I think that if you are a business and you haven't engaged with the portfolio of ISO climate standards, again, make 2024 the year that you do, because the sooner we can standardize what good looks like, the quicker we will actually get to the outcomes that we're trying to reach.
Brilliant. And I think my calls to action now, I've got two as well. So the first one is, I think, and listening to the discussion, it's been fascinating to hear about, how do we give youth a voice? So what I would want to see is national standards bodies creating a youth panel in which young people can channel their thoughts and ideas and input into the standards development process, particularly around climate and sustainability. So I think that's one for standards bodies. And I think the other for employers, for companies, is where you have opportunities, you should be giving young people a chance and invest in their skills and capability, because they are the people who are going to drive change at the pace and scale that we need over time. So we need more people coming into this, and we need to tap the resources that we have in terms of people power to drive that change. So thank you for being part of this session and making your contributions. It's a fantastic audience. And enjoy the rest of your COP. Thank you.